Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Jessica, Executive Director of Wild Cumberland.
And I'm Devin, a Wild Cumberland volunteer.
We appreciate you being here.
Ever since the beginning of this podcast, we have always wanted to bring on additional guests and dig deeper into some topics. And today we are doing just that. In this special episode, we will delve into the history of sea turtle protection efforts on Cumberland Island with special guest, attorney Hal Wright. If his name sounds familiar to some of you, that's likely because Hal and his work have been featured in some of the books and histories written about Cumberland Island National Seashore. Hal is an attorney who lives in Athens, Georgia, but he made a special trip to Atlanta to record with us today, and we are immensely grateful.
Hal, thanks for being here and being willing to spend some time in conversation with us. Now, in full disclosure, before we begin this conversation, I want to ensure our listeners understand that you are currently involved in litigation against the federal and state government related to Cumberland Island. But that is not what we're here to discuss today.
But we do hope to get to that in the future, right?
Definitely.
Awesome. Today, though, we are here to talk about sea turtles. The Loggerhead Sea Turtle, or the Caretta, is the most common sea turtle on Georgia's coast and is found in our waters year-round. From about May through September, they crawl ashore at night and dig nests along our barrier island beaches to lay their eggs. It makes sense that Cumberland Island's 18-mile undeveloped coastline is the most important loggerhead sea turtle nesting site in the state of Georgia.
That's right. We mentioned briefly in our January email newsletter that Cumberland Island's sea turtle protection efforts, which are managed by the state of Georgia, were only implemented after legal action was initiated in the 90s. In this special episode, we're going to dive deep into that history with Hal, who was instrumental in establishing those protections. Hal, I think this is probably a good place to give an overview of the Endangered Species Act, which is sometimes called the ESA, in case you're familiar with that term, just for everybody's understanding as we talk about species.
Sure. I'd say in its simplest form, the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act, protects endangered and threatened species. The Act also limits certain types of activities, as is spelled forth actually in statute itself, and those would be things such as killing a particular species, harming it, harassing it, pursuing it, hunting it, capturing it, collecting it, importing and exporting these particularly listed species. And those terms are specifically set out and defined in the Act itself. The Act requires federal agencies to use their authority to recover these protected species and to particularly ensure that they will not destroy, they being the agencies themselves, or adversely modify the critical habitats upon which these species depend. Not only are they required not to modify the critical habitat, but they're also required to protect the critical habitat and also to expand the critical habitat where they are able to do so.
And just so we're all on the same page here, what exactly is a critical habitat?
I can help here if you want. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that it's refers to areas that feature physical or biological things that are essential to the conservation of a species, and they often require special management or protection. So, as Hal alluded, these agencies are required to avoid destruction or potentially adverse modification, and to his point, they're required to look to expand those protections where they're applicable.
So the federal government listed the Loggerhead Sea Turtle in 1978 after the seashore was established by Congress in 1972. And before the wilderness designation occurred in 1982. I know that was a lot of dates that I threw out there, but my general understanding is that by 1989, almost every barrier island in Georgia had sea turtle monitoring and protection efforts in place. Whether they were initiated or managed by owners, residents, or private groups. But it seems like every island was sort of doing its own thing, and there wasn't a cohesive or comprehensive approach. So thankfully, Hal is here to help us better understand what was or what was not happening on Georgia's coast, including Cumberland Island in the 90s.
The best place to start would be where I was in the 1990s, so I guess specifically in 1994, and about really sort of how I came to to deal with sea turtles in the first place. So in 1994, I had gone back to law school, and I was taking an environmental, what they call a practicum course, which requires each student to create their own environmental project, if you will, that focused on an environmental problem. And so I was sort of shopping around trying to figure out what a good problem might be. And I went and talked to someone that I had worked with when I had been at UGA about a decade earlier, getting a master's degree in environmental policy. And he had suggested that I look at the issue of the Ossabaw Island hogs and Caretta. And that situation basically involved the hogs on Ossabaw, which were recognized at that time as being unique in and of themselves. They drank salt water and they did all these other special things. And they were considered to be unique species, sort of different than feral hogs generally, but still feral hogs. And they were having a really adverse impact on loggerhead sea turtles, which obviously were a protected species. So you have two species, one which was really not a native species per se, and one that obviously was, the loggerhead. And so anyway, so I took that up as a sort of a interesting project to work on. So that was in 1994. That took me to a sea turtle expert that happened to be at UGA by the name of Jim Richardson, who worked at the Institute of Ecology. And he was very, very instrumental in sort of bringing me up to speed as to what the issues were in sea turtle biology and all that. And he was doing it, by the way, was doing a population study and had been doing a population study. I think one of the longest ones and basically ever done on Caretta, based out of Little Cumberland Island. And he put me in touch with another recognized expert on Caretta. On Big Cumberland Island by the name of Carol Ruckteschell.
So that was your, sorry to cut you off, that was
fine.
your entryway into Cumberland Island.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So as a law student, I was trying to learn as much as I could. So I went to Little Cumberland Island just to get a feel for what was going on there, and with Jim Richardson, and also went to Big Cumberland Island, met with Carol, picked her brain as best I could. And so I think it's real important to understand what I learned from Jim Richardson as far as population dynamics of loggerheads and why any of this stuff matters and why a hog eating a sea turtle nest is important to address and control. I think it's just important to understand this. Jim taught me several things that are dynamics not only for loggerheads, but I think for protected species in general. And I got to say right here that, you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm a non-scientist. One thing about lawyers, we know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a whole lot about anything. So, my details may not be exactly right, but I'm going to try to simplify this as best I can. So there's several principles, I guess, that are sort of important, and I'm going to put it in the context of the loggerhead. The first thing he sort of emphasized to me was that all species have evolved over a long period of time, and they've evolved to endure a certain level of loss of their offspring. So they have strategies of how to protect their offspring and pass on their genes, basically. It's sort of survival of the fittest type of approach. And obviously with the loggerhead, one of their strategies is to lay a lot of eggs. They anticipate they're going to lose so many eggs on the beach. They're going to lose so many hatchlings when they go out to sea. There's going to be other predators that eat their hatchlings, whether they're seabirds or fish or whatever. So they're going to lose so many.
Under naturally occurring circumstances.
Exactly, yeah. So this is thousands of years of evolution. Everything's built into their system. The second was that the species, obviously, their long-term survival depends on a certain number of individuals reaching a reproductive age.
Right. And for sea turtles, that takes how many years?
It's roughly 20 years. Yeah. So
it's not a quick process.
No, and you've got from an egg to when that female returns 20 years hence to that same beach, you have a 20-year lag in effect.
And we know the type of development that can happen on our beaches over 20 years.
Exactly. And that was the third point. So if you have an intervening factor, whatever that is, that disrupts this sort of natural scheme and this natural mortality, then the population declines. You don't have as many nesting females returning. If that happens enough, you have a declining population, and you basically have a crash, and then
the worst.
And then you have extinction.
Right.
So what's happened recently, in the most simple terms, is man has become that intervening factor.
Right.
In a lot of manifestations.
Right.
But mankind has recently become this very, very broad intervening factor that has disrupted all of these reproductive cycles. And so you've got, periodically, you have these animals that are not able to adjust, and they basically go extinct. They can't reproduce. So if you look specifically at Coretta and then on Cumberland, so you have a normal beach that produces, let's say, 100 nests, and these numbers are not necessarily...
Sure. But just for the sake of conversation.
But let's just say you have 100 nests, and they maybe contain 60 eggs apiece. So you have 6,000 eggs that are produced, and you say you have 85% nest success rate, so you have 85% of those 6,000 eggs that make it into the water.
Into the ocean, at least.
So let's say 20 years hence, you have whatever number return as nesting females. Let's say there's 8. I mean, I mean, you'd be surprised that there's not that many, actually.
Sure.
I mean, the mortality of hatchlings that return, I mean, the percentage is very, very low. But it's successful enough to where
the population has been able to sustain itself.
Continues and stabilizes there. But let's say you lose 50% of your nest in a nesting season. 20 years hence, you're going to see half those nesting females are not going to return.
Exponential impact.
Yeah. So if you lose 50% of your nest in, let's say, year after year after year for 5 years, then 20 years hence, you're going to have a really declining nesting success.
Sure.
If you have just an increased depredation rate over and over and over and over again, you're going to have a declining nesting population, and then it just continues to build. So if you have multiple factors intervening causes, you have a population crash.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that 50% a moment ago. So sort of helping us move back towards what was happening on Cumberland. You just took us through the mid-90s and explained some of the science we need to understand. But if I remember correctly, at the time you got involved on Big Cumberland and we're looking, the depredation rate for nests was something like 50%, which was what I guess maybe incited you to get involved, was the understanding of what that rate was and how it would potentially impact the species?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's one thing to say, well, you're losing 50% of your nest or 60% of your nest. You know, we still have 50%.
Right.
So who cares? I mean, so what? I mean,
the ESA cares.
There's still a lot,
Right,
and so what does that matter? What does that look like? We don't see it so much now because the shrimping industry has sort of collapsed in Georgia, but at that particular time in the 90s, it was still pretty robust. You had a lot of strandings of nesting females that were being either caught up in shrimp nets, even though you still had TEDs. You had a lot of boat strikes of turtles. You were losing a lot of nesting females from other causes as well. So there was a lot going on.
So you're not only looking at what happens to the eggs, but once those eggs make it off the beach, you're looking at what happens, in the actual water and them surviving, like you were talking about with the shrimp boats and everything. So it's a multi-leveled trial to get back to nesting, right?
Exactly. I mean, like I said, these are not one-dimensional problems and issues. Yeah. I mean, they're difficult issues to address. I mean, you could have 100% nesting success on some of these beaches and not necessarily mean that you've solved
the problem.
Because there may be other issues out there. I mean, there may be lack of food, or they may be ingesting plastics, or it may be something else killing the nesting females, or something else might be happening. But this was one. Obviously, they never make it to the water. If they never make it past the egg stage, you pretty much know what's going to happen with that.
Well, and I think the important thing is that the ESA is really one of the only mechanisms that we have to help ensure that listed species are actually protected by every means that we have necessary, right? I mean, from a litigative or legal standpoint, the ESA is really one of the only ways for the public to help ensure that protection actually happens.
Correct. I mean, if you compare it to other laws, it is a very compelling law in a lot of different ways because it is a very action-forcing law.
So when you got involved and there was a 50% success rate for nesting sea turtles on Cumberland, what did that look like? What did that process look like for you?
Well, number one, you got to understand I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And they don't teach you in law school
How to fight the good fight.
what the hell to do. So the law school class helped me identify what the problem was. It helped with forcing me to build a team of experts to educate me as to what the biology was surrounding these issues.
Right.
And then I was also blessed that there was a public interest law entity that had been formed in Athens, the Georgia Center for Law and the Public Interest, who I had some relationship with. And so I had approached them to say, hey, this is sort of a cool thing. You don't have any interest in it. And they said, yeah, that's just something that we might be interested in. So they helped with formalizing some of the communications and making it more lawyer-like, if you will. And so we approached the state of Georgia because it looked like this was not just a Ossabaw Island issue or a Cumberland Island issue. It was sort of more broad. It was more of a broad-based issue. And so we went to the state and said, look, this is something that needs to be addressed. And sort of under threat of litigations, they agreed and formed a blue ribbon panel that put together people that including Jim Richardson and a lot of other experts, Fish and Wildlife Service, people from the DNR, and there was a representative from every barrier island in Georgia that were charged with managing those islands. So we had buy-in from all those people, and they put together the management plan. At the time was very, very unique in that it was very comprehensive. It covered all aspects of protecting nesting. I mean, you notice it's a plan for nesting loggerhead sea turtles and their habitat, which just goes to reinforce that is such an important component of protecting a species, is to protect the reproduction efforts and the habitat, which also protects that species and their efforts to reproduce. So if you don't do that, you really, everything else really doesn't matter. So these scientists understood that, and they understood that you had to protect the habitat from the dire impacts of hogs rooting. I mean, it's only not just predating directly the eggs, but it was from rooting up the plants and things that stabilize the dunes. Same thing with the feral horses that we're dealing with now. Anything that disrupts or threatens
the integrity of that ecosystem.
That whole ecosystem, which supports loggerhead sea turtles or seabirds, shorebirds, all of that stuff.
Well, it sounds like a big victory then, to have a comprehensive plan for the management of protecting those areas. I mean, there are 14 barrier islands. That's not a small task to find and gather a group of experts who could agree on the means to do that. I mean, that seems like a victory of sorts.
As compared to not having that, it is, yeah, for sure. So having a plan in place is great, and as you know, that's just the beginning.
Just a piece of it.
That's just the start.
I was going to say, so tell us what happened next. So they created this plan, and the plan begins being implemented along the Georgia coast, and that's in the mid to late 90s.
Yeah, and I believe, I may not have all this correct, I believe DNR then, or the Coastal Resources Division, which is obviously a division of DNR, they created within that division a special entity that sort of was in charge of overseeing this plan and helping coordinate it. And I think that was Mark Dodd. I think it is, and he's still currently doing that. So it did receive some support from the state, but plan's just as good as how it's enforced and how people use it and put it in action. So as far as Cumberland Island was concerned, if you look at, I think it was in 1990, 99 or something, it became obvious that they really weren't implementing the plan as far as the feral hogs were concerned. The depredation rate had gotten back up to almost like 50% of the nests were being lost to hogs and to raccoons. So there again, something needed to be done. So,
and that's when you took further action.
Yeah. We stumbled through figuring out what needed to be done, sent the National Park Service 60-day notice letter saying, hey, look, y'all have agreed to do X, Y, and Z. Y'all really aren't doing that. We understand you're losing, a lot of nests to depredation.
And what was the agency's response?
Well, basically no response. It's like, well, yeah, but
what can you do?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what you want us to do about it. So, well, you need to implement the plan. And so they were basically dragging their feet and everything. So they basically forced litigation on the issue. And as a result of that, we ended up going to court.
Right.
And the judge dismissed the case. The way these things work is most of the time courts will defer, particularly federal courts will defer to the agency. So the courts will not tell or instruct an agency on how to do something. They say, well, this is not we don't have the expertise. We don't want to have the expertise. We don't want to second guess an agency. It's not our job to tell an agency how to do their job. Our job is to say what the law is and whether or not they're acting in accordance with the law. So based on affidavits of the Park Service, their testimony at the hearing and all that, and when they were saying, look, we understand what the law is. We understand we're supposed to protect these nests. And we assure the court that we're going to remove we're going to control and remove all these hogs, and we're going to absolutely protect all these nests. And so they stated all this in affidavits, and they stated it to the court. And basically what the court did was say, look, I've heard what the agency said. I agree with them. I'm going to defer to the agency, and so I'm not going to tell them they've got to do that. They've already told me what they are going to do. And so he basically dismissed the case based on their representations.
And they had indicated that they were going to try to eradicate the population of hogs from Cumberland Island in their testimony. If I recall,
that's sort of my recollection and what I was able to glean from my notes.
And because I remember reading it and thinking 3 years.
3 years? Mm-hmm. Well, so it's 2024, right?
Wow, yeah.
And there's obviously still feral hogs everywhere.
Right.
In like the best conditions, and one might argue Cumberland Island, they do offer some of the best conditions for hogs to thrive.
I would agree with that.
A population of wild pigs can probably double in about 4 to 6 months,
least,
something
yeah.
like that. I know you're not a scientist, Hal, but do you think that full eradication is achievable for the feral hogs, specifically on an island with wilderness?
Or do you think the agency just didn't maybe understand the difficulty and costs involved when they made that sort of commitment to eradicate the hogs from the island?
It's probably a little bit of both. I think probably at this time, the Park Service's priorities changed a little bit. I think they understood what they needed to do.
And we're still looking at the early 2000s about?
Yeah, we're looking around 2000, 2001. As best I could recall, right around in that period of time, there was a shift in the park to change their view away from natural resources to more of a cultural resource slant. So I think perhaps it became a juggling of priorities at that particular time. That's not an excuse. I think they got pressured to maybe divert their resources and attention to other places. Yeah.
Well, I know just from the little bit of research I've done that the Park Service has at least been able to eradicate feral hogs from a particular park. There was Channel Islands National Park in the 90s. I think they successfully managed to eradicate a population on one of the islands within that park. But it seems to me to be, given what we know about hogs and their reproduction, and then the sort of impenetrable wilderness that we have on Cumberland, it would seem to be a very difficult task for complete eradication. But I think it's important to remember this is all still in the early 2000s. It's been 20 years. And since that time, they've issued a FONSI on something that was called the Southeast Coastal Species of Concern Predation Management Plan. There's always a big name for everything.
There's
so many
long
words.
names for stuff.
But it approaches it, I guess, at sort of a regional level, how they are supposed to handle these types of situations when there's a protected or listed species that is vulnerable or being potentially adversely affected by something else within, the area. And I think that's what gives the Park Service authority now to remove coyotes as well on the island. And that was in 19. So that's more recently. And then in 23, the Park Service received almost $1 million, $760,000 specifically for feral hog predation management, I should say. I should not use the word eradication, but management on the island.
How do we know how they were planning on spending that $760,000 for that plan?
I have no detail on that at all. I understand that they were sort of supposed to serve as a model and a guide for other units within the region.
If you look like at, for instance, Hawaii,
yeah,
they've got a huge problem with not only feral hogs, feral animals of all
kinds. Sure.
And they've lost all kind of indigenous birds and other animals. And they have been trying to eradicate all of those feral or exotic species.
Yeah,
they've spent a bunch of money. That's not to excuse the Park Service, but if you don't make it a priority and you don't devote the resources to it, you're going to get out of control. You're never going to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
We know from the Santa Rosa Island and their eradication of the hogs, there are obviously success stories out there if you devote the time and the resources to that, right? Do you guys know if you mentioned the predation and everything? Do you know if that remains to be the primary cause of the sea turtle nest loss? There's limited data out there about that specific thing, so that would be interesting to do a little research on.
Well, I don't know if there's limited data or you're unable to get the data that. Which is those are two different things.
They are.
And so and then there again, there may be other causes of. It may not be nest predation. There may be another.
Category or issue at hand.
Sure. Like for instance, maybe 2 years ago they had. This is a climate change issue. They had a really late storm, and they lost every remaining nest on the beach was drowned. And so when you've got these late storms, these changes with the dune systems being unable to migrate like they normally do.
A little bit about that, yeah.
These late storm events will flood and they'll just drown all the hatchlings that haven't hatched yet. So you got that coming too. Is that a natural event or is that a man caused? And you could argue that both ways.
Do you know if the NPS, if they have any obligations or policies or mandates of its own that really compel that agency to protect endangered or threatened species, including the turtles? And this is obviously outside of the Endangered Species Act. Or is that the only thing that's holding them to that? Without
getting too deep into the legal weeds here, the Park Service has definitely got about a lot of different policies and rules that require them to refrain from taking any action that would impair a park resource. I guess the key word in your question is whether they're compelled. Most of those laws don't compel action per se, and that's always the legal fight, is whether or not the agency's required to take those actions, or it's left to their discretion of whether they need to take the actions or not. So to sort of circle back around to Jessica's question initially of why the Endangered Species Act is such an important law, one of the reasons is the Endangered Species Act doesn't really allow a whole hell of a lot of discretion. I mean, it's pretty much, you shall not basically harm a protected species. You're to protect it, period, end of story. Right. So to your question, there are arguably laws that require the Park Service to act in such a way as to not impair all of these resources and all the species. I mean, so a species doesn't have to be listed as being special.
Right.
It's every
important.
Species,
right.
Within the park. So they're not supposed to impair any of them. They're supposed to act in a way that maintains and protects all of these resources. So, I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. So, I mean, yes, the agency should, right? It's basically the answer,
right? Well, something else to consider, and I know we're getting close to wrapping up, but I want to say Loggerhead sea turtles were listed as endangered in 1978, but the federal government did not designate any critical habitat for them, which, as Hal's told us, is required under law by the ESA, until 2014. And that only happened after a lawsuit was filed by conservation groups. So it's 36 years, Devin, that it took them to designate critical habitat for the Loggerhead sea turtle. And
you were a huge stepping stone for that, Hal. I mean, and you and your work with Jim Richardson being, putting you on the Cumberland Island and then just the feral hog issue in general. I believe you were a huge stepping stone for that.
Well, I think our federal agencies have been entrusted to serve as guardians, right? We use that language sometimes about guardians for our public lands, and they're supposed to keep them protected for future generations. The ecosystems, the species within them, the ecosystems that these species are relying on and the other species are relying on, they're also entrusted to their care. Mm-hmm. So, they have a responsibility, but it's clear from just this conversation with Hal and from so much of the history that we can read that citizen engagement and legal action by people who are paying attention are both necessary and effective methods to ensure that our agencies and systems do protect these animals like they're supposed to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I've learned a lot, and I think I want to go back because we talked about the sea turtle data and remind everybody that you can view the sea turtle data online, some of it anyway, at seaturtle.org. But everybody should be familiar with how to help protect these animals when they're visiting Cumberland Island. So to volunteer with sea turtle protection efforts, we get this question a lot. Actually, my inbox is often full of questions. People would like to get involved with the sea turtle protection efforts on Cumberland. You actually have to apply for an internship through the Student Conservation Association. So we unfortunately can't help you with that. But I can head off some of the emails we'll get after this podcast, because somebody will always ask, how can I work and volunteer with the sea turtles on Cumberland?
And they can also continue to learn about sea turtle protection efforts and specifically the Cumberland Island sea turtle data online at seaturtle.org if you're at all interested in that. Everyone, though, should be familiar with how to protect these animals, especially when visiting Cumberland Island itself. The immediate thing that pops into my head is use the red light function at night when you're looking, right?
Sure.
So, as you said, to volunteer with the sea turtle protection efforts on Cumberland Island National Seashore, you are required to apply for that internship through the Student Conservation Association. But that pretty much brings us to the end of this special episode with Mr. Hal Wright. We are grateful for the work that you and obviously the others who have come before us have put in to help protect Cumberland Island and its wilderness and the many species who depend on it. So we really appreciate you coming down here for this and just the work that you've done, not only for Cumberland Island, but just for endangered species and nature in general. So thank you, Hal.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the work that both of you do, and Wild Cumberland as well. So critters need all the help they can get. So thank you very much.
Got it. We know how valuable your time is, so thanks for choosing to spend some of it with us today. Stay wild.
As always, we can't do this work without your help. If you value the information and services our organization provides, including this podcast, please consider making a donation to support our work now at wildcumberland.org. The Wild Cumberland Podcast is produced by Vertical River, and this episode was edited by Greg Cuson.